Our next witness is Tom Fitton, and if I'm wrong, please correct me when you start. He's president of Judicial Watch, a position he's held since 1998. Judicial Watch describes itself as a public interest group that investigates and prosecutes government corruption, seeking to ensure that the government and judicial officials act ethically and do not abuse the powers entrusted to them by the American public. Judicial Watch primarily seeks access to government records, files Freedom of Information Act and other public records lawsuits, and engages in other forms of civil litigation. Mr. Fitton has had over 20 years of public policy experience. He received his BA in English from George Washington University. You are recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Cohen. And like the other participants, we really appreciate your prayer at the beginning. Unfortunately, for years, Americans have been losing faith in the integrity of our elections. Last year, Gallup has been tracking this for years. Last year, they asked if Americans have confidence in the integrity of elections and the honesty of elections specifically. Only 40% of Americans said yes, 59% said no. And frankly, this isn't helped by plans like Governor Newsom, who issued by an executive order recently requiring the county election officials transmit mail ballots to every registered voter in the state. I view this as the real threat to the integrity of our elections. In 2005, back when there was a bipartisan understanding about the threat of voter fraud and its connection to voter fraud, to vote by mail and absentee ballots, the Carter-Baker Commission noted that absentee balloting is vulnerable to abuse in several ways. Blank ballots mailed to the wrong address to large residential buildings might get intercepted. Citizens who vote at home, at nursing homes, at the workplace, or in church are more susceptible to pressure, overt and subtle, or to intimidation. Vote buying schemes are far more difficult to detect when citizens vote by mail. We're particularly concerned about ballots being mailed to the wrong address. Voter registration lists throughout the country are out of date, containing registrations for voters who no longer live at the stated address, who have died, or otherwise are ineligible to vote. A Pew Research Center from many years back found that there were 24 million, or 1 out of every 8, active voter registrations in the United States that were no longer valid or significantly inaccurate. At least 1.8 million deceased individuals were listed as active voters at that time. I don't think things have gotten much better. Data states provided to the Election Assistance Commission in 2019 showed hundreds of U.S. counties with voter lists containing more registered voters than there were citizens over the age of 18, meaning that the registration rate was over 100%. And looking at that data, we concluded there were at least 2.5 million extra registrants on our nation's voter rolls. The extra registrations include both the outdated and currently active registrations, as well as inactive registrations that are pending removal. Note that even inactive registrations can still be voted upon on Election Day. This doesn't require a voter to use a provisional ballot. The voter just needs to show up and say, or affirm his or her address typically, and in many states that can be done just through an oral representation. To be clear, the poll worker asks the voter if she or she lives at the listed address, and the voter just says yes. At that point, the voter can vote. Many counties have lists containing outdated registrations. As I said, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, after we warned them about this, removed nearly 70,000 names from their list because people hadn't voted within the legally required 2 election cycles. It only removed them after receiving a warning letter. North Carolina's own published data shows nearly 1 million inactive registrations. Pennsylvania admits to 800,000 extra registrations. We've sued those states to try to clean those rolls up. Governor Newsom's executive order in California seems particularly cynical. While he has relied on emergency powers in the face of the pandemic to order all mail ballot elections, he notably has failed to restrict ballot harvesting under state law, which means that people will be showing up and interacting with people as they gather ballots, increasing, obviously, the likelihood of health issues. Public health is cited as justification for mail ballots, but is absent when talking about the massive ballot harvesting schemes being foisted upon, or the attempt to foist ballot harvesting schemes on Americans. Look, in the end, this crisis, this pandemic has blown up our economy. It's suppressed our liberties. Let's not blow up our elections.
Questions for Mr. Fitton. In May, House Democrats passed the HEROES Act, as has been discussed, and it included various proposals aimed at federalizing the election process. One of those proposals, as we know, is ballot harvesting. That's still a term that's unfamiliar to a lot of Americans who haven't experienced that. Could you briefly explain what ballot harvesting is and why it's so susceptible to fraud?
Well, ballot harvesting, in the way critics have described it, such as Judicial Watch, would allow third-party strangers to go around and collect ballots and then allegedly deliver them to polling places or locations where ballots are collected. And in California, they have an extreme version of ballot harvesting that has virtually no regulation about who can do it, whether they can select someone based on whether they're Democrats or Republicans. They don't have real checks in place to make sure ballots are delivered. And obviously, when you have third party strangers going around collecting ballots, that's a recipe for voter intimidation. It's one thing to allow, in emergency circumstances, a terribly, for instance, infirm person to have their spouse deliver a ballot for them. It's far different to have party operatives and interested third parties roaming the streets, knocking on doors, and demanding or quote asking for ballots. It's a recipe for voter intimidation, and that's why it is largely banned across the country. We rightly opposed what happened in North Carolina with that ballot harvesting fraud, but of course, ballot harvesting was illegal in North Carolina, and you can see why, because of the temptation for fraud. So this bill that's out there, as best I can tell, would nationalize this intimidatory ballot harvesting scheme, upend the voting laws in terms of voter ID in 35 states, and undermine the security to the extent it's available or has been implemented in the few states that are pursuing it on absentee ballots. It's a talk about causing chaos on election day. To do this so quick, so close to election day, is just irresponsible in my view.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adams. Democrats have also proposed that states, when an election is held, quote, in an area in which an emergency or disaster, unquote, is declared, will automatically mail absentee ballots to registered voters in that area. And your organization, the Public Interest Legal Foundation, found that 244 counties spanning 29 states, in addition to the District of Columbia, had voter registration rates over 100% of the population. How might these bloated registration rolls lead to increased fraud if the states adopt all mail voting?
Right, and we've upped the game of just looking at that ratio, where we've actually looked at the rolls, and as you see in my written testimony, individuals like Rashawn Slade in Pittsburgh are registered 7 different times. We have duplicate registrations around the country. People get on the rolls in multiple states. If you had automatic vote mail-outs, Mr. Ranking Member, you would have people like Rashawn Slade getting 7 ballots to vote in the Pennsylvania election. That's not good policy, no matter what the need.
Very good. But Mr. Fitton, back to you. The election clause in the U.S. Constitution gives each state the authority to administer elections within its jurisdiction, and it only gives Congress the authority to step in to regulate federal elections, as we know. But arguably, states are best positioned to administer elections to address their own unique needs. Do you agree with that sentiment? And if so, what challenges do you foresee if every state is forced to administer an election in the same manner?
Well, one size fits all isn't going to work. You have the Baker Carter Commission note the Oregon example as being the exception that proves the rule. Just because it may work in Oregon doesn't mean it will work in other states. In states where you have populations that are moved in and out more quickly, you have tremendous risk to having all mail voter fraud, or increased risk for voter fraud as a result of having these mail ballots flood the system, both frankly applications and ballots directly. The concern is, are the states doing sensible steps to make sure that people are able to vote on election day? And look, what we're hearing about today is a plan that's been in place long before COVID. So they're using, in my view, the pretext of the pandemic as an excuse to get a policy proposal that will undermine election integrity. Why oppose voter ID? Why oppose federal law that requires states to take reasonable steps to clean up the rolls? Why oppose even the notion of citizenship verification? To me, that's setting up the steal. And the American people have the right to have confidence in their elections, And when I hear about the rare instances of voter fraud, I get frustrated. If it's your vote that's stolen, it's your
We've
civil
gone
right
5
that's
minutes.
destroyed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Our next questioner will be Mr. Gohmert of Texas. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too appreciate the way you started this hearing. I've been used to Christian beliefs being belittled by majority too many times since your arrival in 2007. So I'm really honest in saying how much I appreciate the tenor with which you started this hearing. I also want to express hearts and prayers going out for George Floyd family and all of those. It's just tragic, the looting and rioting we've seen, especially costing minority businesses their life's work. Real tragedy, and we need to bring about this same type of feeling that we've had in this hearing. We can disagree, but not get violent, not destroy people, or for goodness sakes, the Italia Marie Kelly, who was killed by a protester, and her sister simply, it wasn't a cop, it was one of you people, protesters, that kind of stuff. We all need to encourage that kind of thing to stop. And I keep hearing in this hearing, though, about the concern over the COVID-19 or coronavirus, but I haven't heard any of our witnesses for the majority express that concern about the protests, the rioting and looting, whereas in many places we're not even allowed to go unless we wear a mask. But that's those of us who are trying to be law-abiding. Mr. Fitton, do you recall the aftermath of the election in 2000 and, 2001, who it was that was screaming for election reform and that every single county, every parish, everybody needed to go to electronic voting, and they pushed the majority, Republican majority, into passing a federal law mandating, unfunded mandate, requiring electronic voting. You recall that?
Yes, many on the left objected to the outcome in Florida, how it was determined, and obviously that was impacted by the controversy over paper ballots. So there was this push for electronic voting. Generally speaking, all the voting machines that were engineered as a result of that money, they're all getting old, and they all need to be replaced. And there is no secure way to vote over the internet. We don't have the technology to do it. We don't have the competency to do it. And the least second most secure way to vote is over the mail. If you want the vote, if you want to be sure your vote is counted, the best way to do it is to show up and vote. And to hear inflammatory rhetoric that you're choosing your life over your vote, it's just not appropriate. And it causes people to be nervous about voting. That is as suppressive as anything I've heard. Telling people they're going to die or likely to die if they vote. We can see that people will exercise their First Amendment rights if they think it's important. Voting's important, and they will vote in person. They should be able to vote in person without being scared to death about doing it.
Well, we've already heard in this hearing that we watched Wisconsin voters getting sick, and that occurred on April 7, 2020. But my understanding was Wisconsin held that vote without the mail-in mandate, and actually they did not see a spike in COVID-19 cases. Are you familiar with what happened in Wisconsin?
I'm not aware of any public health impact to voting in person, and the COVID pandemic is receding. We now know that the concerns about it were largely overblown. If you have true concerns in many states, you can vote by absentee ballot. Frankly, I think absentee ballots are too readily available, but the law is what it is. And this is a solution in search of a problem. If you want to vote by mail, you likely can. So let's stop fooling people and let's start preparing for the election rather than trying to upend the election The time has
Right.
passed. We
Well,
got
let
to
me,
be printing
get
ballots.
this
We got to be
before my
printing
time
ballots this month.
expires. I needed to ask unanimous consent. This was an exhibit authored by Christian Adams and Hun von Spakowski, COVID-19 and Ebola, what we can learn from prior elections. I'd ask that be made part of the record without objection.
Without objection, it'll be done.
And I meant to get to Mr. Adams, but my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your opening remarks and for the opening prayer, and our thoughts and prayers are with American people during this difficult time. It's an unprecedented time in the history of our nation. In the midst of a global pandemic, citizens will be asked to do their civic duty by participating in elections, not just in November, but in primaries and in local elections. And just last month, cities and towns in my home state of Virginia held local elections. And not only did they appear to have been held without incident, but in some cases, the turnout was higher than in previous elections. COVID-19 has changed how we live our lives with every decision we make, weighing the risks of our actions, whether it's grocery shopping, planning doctor's visits, and even now voting. As election day approaches, it's important for us to consider what we can do to ensure that it's conducted safely, securely, with strong protections against fraud, and fairly with accuracy. While I believe that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would agree with those goals, I am concerned that HR 1 and their proposal to federalize essentially our election process would largely impede those goals. The Constitution vests states with the responsibility to administer elections. That's because each state is best positioned to run their own elections. And even more concerning, the prospect of losing a state's ability to best address the needs of their own citizens and localities is the potential of fraud that federalizing elections could cause or encourage. Although I support absentee balloting and support recent efforts in Virginia to move to an all absentee or no excuse absentee balloting, I'm concerned with some of the proposals for mail-in voting, especially as it applies to those states that don't have updated voter rolls. When you vote in Virginia absentee, the voter must request the absentee ballot. They have to fill out the ballot in the presence of a witness, although during COVID-19 that's been waived. And they must sign the envelope before returning it to the registrar. We take appropriate measures to ensure that anyone who needs an absentee ballot receives one, and anyone who returns a completed absentee ballot has their vote counted. As the U.S. Election Assistance Commission has noted, maintaining accurate voter registration lists is essential to protecting election integrity. And that's where we have differing standards all around the country. While COVID-19 has presented us with challenges, Congress has stepped up and acted by passing the CARES Act, which provides around $400 million to help states and to prepare for, and respond to coronavirus domestically and internationally for the 2020 federal election cycle. And I want to ask Mr. Fitton, it's been suggested that states, when an election is held in an area in which an emergency or disaster is declared, automatically mail absentee ballots to registered voters in that area. Do you have any concerns with that proposal, or with an all mail-in voting requirement absent updating the voter registration rolls?
Yes, specifically in California, we have a settlement with the state of California, Los Angeles County, where they are removing right now up to 1.6 million names from their rolls. Our analysis from last year found 14 counties totaling over 1 million extra names on the roll. So in theory, all those folks would get ballots because they're still registered to vote. And Newsom's plan, aside from its legality, whether he has the authority to do it, it's bad policy. Look, I understand that we need to be prepared for a potential surge in absentee ballot requests, but it's the wrong way to vote if you're concerned about secure voting. It should be reserved for emergency situations, our military deployed overseas. And if you want your vote to be secure and counted, the best way to ensure that is to go and vote in person. And we have these concerns about COVID-19. How does that comport with this massive push for ballot harvesting, which is illegal virtually everywhere? Ballot harvesting means people going around and taking ballots in person from people. This is the old adage, never let a crisis go to waste, and the left is doing it here. What this debate is undermining our confidence in elections because it's confusing people. They can vote in person, they can pursue mail-in ballots as appropriate if they need to, but we should be encouraging people to vote in person. That's the best way to be sure that your votes are secure and counted.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Our next questioner will be Mr. Armstrong. And Mr. Armstrong, thank you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for having this hearing. It gives me my sporadic opportunity to educate people on how we do things in North Dakota. And I think I would start with saying there truly are no federal elections. There are only local elections that elect federal officers and federal elected officials. And I know that because North Dakota has probably the easiest voting in the entire country. We have no voter registration. We have 30-day residency requirement. We allow felons to vote when they are out of prison, and we're proud of all of those things. And I think that is one of the problems I have significantly with how we are doing this. And just to be clear, during this primary, during COVID, we are doing vote by mail throughout the whole state. It was actually fairly easy for us to set up because we have a number of vote by mail counties already that are almost exclusively vote by mail. But as is always the case when we try and do these things from a federal level, when we are attempting to solve a perceived problem somewhere else, it will cause problems in places like mine. There are things we do very well, but we do them in the aspect of being a very, very rural state. Requiring 20 days early voting in a county with 700 people doesn't make any sense. And in fact, we have spent many years in different counties and different jurisdictions to get this right. We have places that are that have extended early voting, and then we have places that shorten it up but have it open significantly outside business hours. We do a lot of those things. The other thing we do with all absentee and early voting is require that it's postmarked the day before the election. North Dakotans want to know the result of their election on election day. But just other things that exist in all of these different proposals that make it difficult. Mandating that when a declared emergency exists, that it's automatically vote by mail is pretty interesting for us. What most people call weather emergencies, we usually call Tuesday. In varying degrees, in some place or another within our state, there is a federally declared emergency, whether it's for drought, flood, blizzard, all of those different things. These proposals forbid ID requirements for vote by mail. We need voter ID because we don't have voter registration. It would be contrary to North Dakota state law. And there's a conflict with all of those different things. But as we spend so much time talking about how we deal with voter registration and the different issues involved in that, again, North Dakota doesn't have it. And so we deal with different things. And I have to say, too, even as we're doing this right now in North Dakota, you want your population to have confidence in the ballot, in the voting process. And in our Secretary of State's zeal and effort, which I applaud, to ensure that everybody had the opportunity to vote, I should also say that if more than 3/4 of the ballots that have been requested by absentee voting in North Dakota are returned, this will be our highest voter turnout in the history. I anticipate that probably won't be the case and will be closer to at or slightly above average. But when we do this, we are seeing, and people are getting ballots sent to their house, ballot applications sent to their house for people who haven't lived there in 3 generations. And those types of things cause voters to cause concern over that. And we need to continue to move forward. So I guess my question for either, I suppose Mr. Fitton, as we nationalize these things for a state like North Dakota, we would have to completely revamp how we do our voting. And in our case, it would actually be more restrictive, not less, to our citizens. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's the concern here. You have this national plan that is being proposed that would upend the voting laws in all states in some form or another. And from our perspective, most importantly, the laws that secure the vote, such as voter ID laws. You know, most Americans support voter ID in significant numbers, both Republican and Democrat. And, you know, this is a non-controversial issue other than some hardcore activists on one side who oppose voter ID using fraudulent numbers and reasons for doing so, in my view. Look, you should be able to vote in November. We all agree on that. We want people to be safe. We also want the votes to be secure. Blowing up the system now is the wrong thing to do, whether at the national level or even state by state, where you get confusion reigning as opposed to reassuring voters their votes will be counted in the ordinary course, in the ordinary way. Just vote as you normally are used to doing so. We'll get through it. What we're hearing now is an effort to disrupt the elections, not to secure them.